The two players UConn is banking on to keep them on top. You're Locked On UConn.
You are Locked On UConn, your daily podcast on the UConn Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On UConn your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Do me a favor, before we get into the show, see that little button on the bottom of your screen? Click subscribe, helps our channel grow, helps our audience grow, and frankly, I truly appreciate all of your support. It's invaluable to me. Well, to quote the great mystic Dan Hurley, solo ball may be our biggest non-conference win of the year. He was critical. He was a critical player in the Carolina game, one of our biggest victories in the Big East season. Jaylin Stewart played huge for us down the stretch of that Marquette game at the Garden. I think Jaylin and Solo have a chance to make a huge jump like we've seen freshmen to sophomores make for us. Look at some of the players we've had make those huge jumps. I think we can expect that. I think they expect that. And again, they had moments this year when they flashed big-time ability for us. We're projecting what they're going to be next November, and we've seen it on a daily basis. So that is straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So if you look at this and say, I'm not high on a specific player, they certainly are. And I think you have to look at Dan Hurley and his staff for what they are, which is they stand on business. If a player is not cutting it, he's not playing. And so they have truly doubled down, especially on what I believe is the two players that will 100% keep them on top of the college basketball rankings. Let's just dive back into who these guys are. Solo ball. He was the 44th ranked player in the country, coming in as a freshman in 2023. At his position, he was fourth in the country in the class of 2023. His vertical is now close to 45 inches. I think we've seen some of that on social media, which is insane. How many of us old guys who think they can still hoop would be psyched if we could have a vertical of about 25? So that's just his physicality and his physical traits are stuff of legend, scary stuff. Solo's got a 6'10" wingspan. That's why our multi-time guest Tobias Bass of The Athletic says he has those go-go gadget arms. When you describe Solomon, I know everyone likes to call him Solo, and I do too. He's a slippery left-handed player, very explosive. I love when he goes to the basket and he rises up for his jump shot. I think we saw a ton of that, top of the key and also from the free throw line extended. He has emerged as a name to watch who could make that leap, and then people are going to start looking at him as an NBA-style player. He's got a unique combination of explosiveness, scoring prowess, and defensive ability. I mean, think about the wingspan, his ability to create deflections, just an absolutely intriguing prospect. And we saw flashes of it. I think Dan talked about the Carolina game. I was on business in St. Louis, and I remember having to kind of peek over and watch most of that game while I was trying to pay attention to a work dinner, but all the while was 100% glued to, at least my right eye was 100% glued to the television screen above the bar. And I remember Solo coming in and really dominating that game. I think he had 13 points. Really showed he belonged against a team that was the number one seed in the Carolina Tar Heels. And he just has the ability to score at each level. He's a great 3-point shooter. I know he didn't show a ton of that this year, but you have to think about the small sample. Where was he getting minutes? The team that we had was the most efficient offensive basketball team of the last 25 years. Pretty damn good. But his ability to finish at the rim, I think, will be shown this year. And he's also a competitive kid. I mean, how many cool blocks did he have this year in early games when he was getting more minutes, just coming out of nowhere and just showing that athletic ability and that wingspan. This is one of the biggest things that I don't think a ton of people know. When Solo was a freshman in high school, he was only 5'5", which by comparison, if you just watch the roast of Tom Brady, that is the size of Kevin Hart, 5'4", 5'5". And I think I'm giving Kevin Hart too much credit, but right around that same size. So he's now a 6'4" kid, but he plays with that tenacity of being the shortest guy on the team, of having to fight and claw for everything. And I think that to me is what I love about him. So crafty lefty with exceptional ball handling skills and finishing skills, explosive athlete, defensive upside with that wingspan. He's a confident kid. He's got the potential to develop his shooting, and his competitive spirit is always up, right? You know, we talk about Dan Hurley saying their toughness meter, and we say it at the end of every show. I think Solo his toughness meter is constantly rising. So to me, Solo is a late bloomer with a absolutely incredibly high ceiling. Jaylin Stewart. What more can you say about Jaylin? I mean, if you go back, he was the 60th ranked player nationally, 12th at his position of small forward. He's a 3-tier scorer, good from three, ball handling, willing and precise passer, athletic as all hell, long, silky, smooth jump shot. He's the type of player Yukon can rely on next year to get his own when plays break down. If you look at some of his film from high school and then you look at some of the stuff he did last year, his ability to back you down and shoot over you is, he's 6'7", 6'8". I see that as a part of his game, making that next level jump for there. Him along with Solo, Aiden, and Ahmad Noel. I think we're going to have a incredible amount of talented players that know how to handle the rock. That if stuff breaks down in this really efficient offense that they've created, they will have that covered as well. And I think Jaylin's ability and what he showed in flashes last year is going to make the anticipation for Alex Karaban's decision even more nerve-wracking, because if Alex comes back, I mean, whoa. I think we see some, I think the Warriors had that lineup of death where they put Draymond Green at the 5. If the Huskies get Alex Karaban back, I think you see a bunch of that next year, because as much as I love Sampson, as much as I think Terrace Reed Jr. is going to be a nice piece for the Huskies, there are games where you don't need that really big body the way that a lot of teams do. And the way UConn plays, if you can put Alex at the 5, I think we see some lineups where it's Alex at the 5, Jaylin at the 4, Liam McNeely at the 3, Solo at the 2, and Ahmad Noel at point. All I can say is good luck to anybody that has to play against that team. Because if that team is firing on all cylinders between the athleticism, the shooting ability, the creativity with ball handling, and you could swap guys out. Alex at the 5, Jaylin at the 4, Liam at the 3, Aiden at the 2, Haas at the 1. Lots of stuff going on with this UConn team, but I think if Alex doesn't come back, he can slide into the position he just left. Let Liam McNeely come in and just ball and ease his way into a role versus thinking he's got to be the immediate successor to one of UConn's legendary champions in Alex Karaban. So I think Jaylin has, as coach said after the MSG game, he earned his wings. He had that impressive performance, 9 points against Marquette. But I think his maturity level is what Dan Hurley is looking for. And I think his maturity level is also what's going to make these jumps between him and Solo not seem so crazy. These guys came in highly touted, and I think they've gone through a year of Dan Hurley's system. So that's going to help when it comes to kind of playing freely and really showing what they're going to do, Stewart's development is helping him reach his full potential, and he's got a bright future, as recognized by coach, as recognized by someone like Alex Karaban, and who is going to predict to continue to grow. And I think he's going to be a star. I think it's going to be an incredible back and forth how they're going to complement each other. So I'm really looking forward to the Solo ball Jaylin Stewart era, and then everybody else buckle in. We're going to talk about what the Big East would look like if we added 3 basketball-only powers to the Big East. Coming up after this. As a family man with 3 kids, managing investments and retirement accounts can be a lot. That's why I use Yahoo Finance to consolidate my Schwab investment account and Fidelity 401k into a convenient hub. For over 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the #1 destination for investors. Whether you're a seasoned investor or seeking expert guidance, Yahoo Finance offers all the tools and data you need in one place. Breaking news, editorial perspective, analyst ratings, and customizable charts. Securely link your brokerage accounts with Yahoo Finance for a unified view of your wealth, including 401k and other investments. Gain comprehensive insights to effectively manage your wealth. For comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit yahoofinance.com, the #1 financial destination. All right, everybody. I wanted to try something different with this segment because with UConn's athletics, I think I am admittedly, I think admittedly the entire fan base focuses more on the basketball team than the football team. And I think doesn't mean that we don't like it, doesn't mean that we don't know about it. It's just kind of been entrenched in our fandom, if you will, right? And I think if we're being super honest, most of us UConn fans, especially growing up when there really wasn't a football program to speak of, you liked other teams. So we're a UConn basketball fan, and because you grew up in the Northeast, you were a Notre Dame football fan. Or maybe you rooted for Miami or some of the Oklahoma, Nebraska, some of these other traditional powers, right? And so what's interesting to me is conference realignment. You don't have to say all or nothing. Hey, we need to add this school. Oh, well, they have too big of a football program, so they wouldn't fit into the Big East. Why should the Big East settle for lower tier programs, at least on an overall scale, when you can add basketball only powerhouses and separate people's football programs as different entities? Because let's face it, I feel like that's where the NCAA is going. If the NCAA is even an entity anymore that's going to make sense for college sports going forward, there has to be some creative aspects of this. So in this hypothetical scenario, I have 3 teams that are 2 of which are blue bloods and 1 of which is kind of like a package deal. So you'll understand where I'm going with this once I start to name the teams that I want the Big East to add in a basketball only situation. So the first one is the Duke Blue Devils. Obvious reasons. We're 4-6 against them all time, but 2-0 in the Final Four. I'd love to have that home at home with them to recreate this rivalry, which I feel like has grown stale and has more to do with the fact that Duke has underwhelmed in the last few years. And we poke fun of Duke for obvious reasons, but a king needs more to conquer. What's the quote? For Alexander wept because he saw the land and there was no more lands to conquer. I mean, at this point, if you're the Yukon Huskies playing a Big East game against DePaul isn't going to cut it anymore. I think it hasn't cut it for years, although I feel like DePaul's on the upswing with Chris Holtzman. Why not make it attractive to leave and then say, listen, if you play football in the SEC or wherever, whatever super football conference that I think is going to be created from all of this movement, and really join the truly best basketball conference in the country, the Big East. It makes too much sense. And if you add Duke, you obviously are going to add Carolina, because North Carolina and Duke are entrenched as a rivalry that's just, I don't think any team that gets one or the other is going to not be able to add said team. Now, listen, if the Big East was a big football conference like the SEC, then I wouldn't care to add them as a in all of the sports. But I think what you need to do is you need to start to kind of look at some of the creative aspects of how to keep the Big East sacred, right? The Big East has already been bastardized a few different times, with us going to the American and then coming back. But the Big East is special, and I don't want UConn to have to make a decision like going to the Big 12 or whatever. Like, I feel like there can be other aspects, and to cater to our basketball program is the obvious play here. So with Carolina, I think we're 2-5 against them all time. Most of those games were played in Chapel Hill or Greensboro Coliseum. UConn getting that win over the Heels at MSG last year. And if you bring in Duke and Carolina to the Big East, you inevitably have to bring in their little brother, NC State. 0-1 against them all time. We lost to a Mark Gottfried-led Wolfpack team, which this is a beautiful name. If you knew this ahead of time, if you think about that game, we saw Enosh Wolf score 12 points off the bench on a Kevin Ollie led team. Had to dive deep into the archives for that game, for the only time we've played the Wolfpack. But here's why this all makes sense. Every single one of these schools is a multi-time national champion. They all have young coaches who are not going anywhere, passionate fan bases. I guarantee right now in the great state of Connecticut, you at minimum see people walking around in Duke gear and North Carolina gear. Probably not NC State, but you hear what I'm saying. But hell, I even love Carolina blue. My high school, like whenever you would walk up and down, people would just wear a Carolina shirt just because it was a good color. So there's definitely some brand recognition there. And in my high school, the Maloney Spartans in Meriden, Connecticut, the greatest running back in our history played for NC State, Rashawn Spikes. So, to me, it would make way too much sense for Connecticut basketball to align themselves with these three schools in Carolina. The Big East should be making plays like this, at least checking the temperature of this. Does that make sense to the other to do Carolina and NC State? And getting the conference to focus on a basketball-only conference. And think about it. Our football team here is an independent. So who cares? We can play basketball anywhere we want. But I really feel like our roots belong in the Big East where it started, and having that little blip in the American, and really just for the future sake and survival of the Big East, adding these type of blue blood basketball programs is 100% what it needs to do. Well, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without any of that screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Well, we'll talk about my top 10 role players. Yes, guys you love on your team. Maybe they didn't play a ton of minutes, but they're a vibe guy. Just absolutely can't not have them on your teams. We're going to talk about my top 10 coming up after this. It's playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball's in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets, guaranteed. That's $150, win or lose. Bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all in an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, everybody. So we all have these players that are on our teams, and we wonder about, not necessarily where they are, but when they come in the game, do they make an impact? So the criteria for this, and whoever I call, if you don't think he was a role player, if you think he was more of a big time contributor, I think the definition of role player has to be discussed before we get into it. Because there's a couple, and I asked a buddy of mine, like who he thought would be on his list. And there were a few players that he put on his list that I was like, I don't know if I'd have them be a role player. And I'll talk to you about it. So I said, if you think of it, give me some names of your favorite role players of all time. I'm doing a top 10 list tomorrow. And my buddy Mikey Casey gave me Albert Mooring, Jerome Dyson, Niels Giffey, Rudy Johnson, Stanley Robinson. And his favorite was Rashad Anderson. So I don't necessarily know if I would consider all 6 of those players as role players. But if you look at it from the definition of did they play a role that wasn't a starring role, then yeah, you could, because Rashad Anderson was a secondary player on one of the greatest teams of all time. So he's definitely on the list. But I'm talking these type of players. And mine could be, I love their name. I loved how they played when they came in, even if it was a sparing role. So here we go. Number 10, Dan Cerulik. Dan Cerulik is a name, and I only remember that name not because of how much he played or how great he was. And Dan was a good player. Don't get me wrong. I mean, he was. If you go back, he had some moments against some really good teams in the 89-90 season. But I'll just remember because as a kid, you have these kind of fun little things that pop into your head about about someone that maybe your parents, when they were yelling at the TV. My dad was a fan of Dan Cerulik, but Dan Cerulik pissed my dad off a lot. I'll just put it that way. I'll never forget that. And then another player who I think was an incredible contributor, number 9 on my list on that same team, Terreno Walker. I've referenced him before, but I just Terreno Walker is the type of player. He reminded me of Charles Oakley. If you go back and look at who that was, not Charles. Hopefully, if you were listening to this, you know who Charles Oakley is. But if you're comparing, give me like an NBA comp of a player that was a good NBA player. That's who I think Terreno Walker reminded me of. And then along those same lines, number 8 on the list, Eric Hayward, big bruising center. I believe he was about 6'10", 250, 260 pounds. Was just an absolute monster. Didn't play a ton, but he was a wide load. Played. I'm sure he, was an interesting cat in the locker room. I met him later in life. I believe probably 5 to 6 years after he played. Just a nice dude. Don't know much about him, but I always appreciated Eric Hayward, the UConn Huskies. Next one on my list, number 7, Rudy Johnson. Rudy Johnson famously is known for, well, first off, wearing the number 23. I always thought that was cool. And then in that Ray Allen game where he was against Georgetown and did that kind of weird pass fake shot, not at the buzzer, but close to it, Rudy Johnson was open on that play and said he wanted the ball, but Ray was like, "No, I'm not giving that ball to Rudy." So I always appreciate that. But Rudy was a good player. He would hit some timely threes, good defensive player, definitely a role player on that 95-96 team. Another one, Antrick Kleber, 6'10", by 230. Didn't get a ton of run, but he played in that Duke finals game. I think he was a glue guy that helped with practice, played a little bit here and there against the lesser opponents during the season. You need all of these guys that I mentioned are, quintessential role players on now what are title teams. This next one is, where are we at? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, number 5. Probably an all-time name at UConn. Monquencio Hardnett, junior college transfer. I just loved his name. When I was a kid, I was like, man, that's such a cool ass name. And he was a pretty good player, man. He could get a little bit of scoring off the bounce, was a decent 3-point shooter. And again, my number 5 role player and is number 1 in all-time names at UConn, in my opinion. Number 4, got to be Albert Mooring. Other than another number 23, was a sneaky good shooter. He was streaky. I wouldn't call him pure, but his delivery reminded me of a role player that will be likely number 1 on this list, or in that top 3. Reminds me of Rashad Anderson. But a poor man's Rashad Anderson. We'll call that for Albert Mooring. Where are we at? Number 3, Suleiman Wan. Suleiman was the type of player, again, in that same Dan Cerulik mold of frustrated you at times, but definitely was, an incredible defensive player as he got older. As a senior, obviously he was on that 98-99 championship team. Suleiman Wan was a cool cat. 6'11", for everything I've read and heard, was a great locker room guy. So he's in my top 5, number 3 on my role player list. The next 2 are tough because there's a lot, and we're going to have some honorable mentions as well. Number 2 role player, Joey Calcaterra. And some people might go, well, he played, a ton on a championship team, but he played a specific role. He was the guy to come in and be a spark plug. I struggled with either him because I feel like he didn't have as big a role as John Gwynn, who is kind of like the microwave of his time in 89-90. John was more of a like an actual a big part of why UConn had that resurgent team in 89-90 that was he had games where he had 20 something points, I think, against a big time talent, whereas Joey was always a guy that came off, and I think he had some of that ability, but you got to go with what actually happened versus what could have happened, and that to me is why I put Joey at 2, and I wouldn't consider John a role player in that respect, at least in my list. And number 1, you gotta give credit where credit's due, and my number 1 role player of all time is Andrew Hurley, because look, guys, I mean, when you think about players and what they go through on a regular basis, I love my father. I've had him on the show. I don't know if I could take 4 years of being coached by him. So it takes a special person, and that's nothing against my dad. It's just like, and I feel like if my dad had the personality of Dan Hurley too, it would be even more difficult. So I have to give absolute kudos to Andrew Hurley. He's the number 1 role player of all time. As someone called him the human victory cigar, what he probably had to go through every day in practice, earning his dad's respect, earning the team's respect, is where I will tip my cap to him 100%. And he's got to be number 1. Some other names on the list, honorable mention, I had Shimon Tools, Easy Ed Nelson, Tyler Olander, who's one of the assistant coaches on our TBT team, Shooting Stars. Niels Giffey is a good one. He's questionable of whether he was a role player or one of the quote unquote big 3 of that championship team. Danelle Beverly, and one of my all-time favorite players, Craig Autry, a Connecticut kid. So, but that's my top 10 with a few honorable mentions left in there for top 10 role players of all time. If you have other players that I missed or wanted to say are better suited for that list, feel free to reach out. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV in the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now, available on the free Fire TV channels app. Well, this has been another episode of Locked On UConn. I'm your host, Mark Zanetto, asking you to stay locked in, stay connected, make sure your toughness meter is always rising. And as always, go Huskies.